Yo, 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 what is up, guys? It's your boy back with another reaction video. We're going to be doing a video titled Why Employers Are Sick of Gen Z. And it's a video by New Money Nate. I've never actually watched this guy before, but I thought this video sounded pretty interesting. And seeing as how I am a Gen Z person myself, I would also be interested in knowing why employers do not like us. So let's get into it. I think this might be very interesting.
Employers are really starting to hate Gen Z, but why? What is so bad? A recent survey of 1,000 managers in the US found that more than half cite frustration and almost to the point of stress in managing Gen Z. Almost a third of those surveyed said that they would ideally avoid hiring a Gen Z candidate, and 18% have contemplated leaving their own job because they think managing Gen Z is too much.
Damn, we're that bad? That's actually kind of crazy. Does he have a source for that? Because I'd actually want to look that up. That's diabolical. I'm going to go look up that survey. I'm actually curious to see what that survey says. If I can find it. If I can't find it, I'll let you guys know. Now, I found this article on resumetemplates.com talking about a survey in which they themselves surveyed 1,000 managers, because I couldn't find the one that this guy was talking about. And you see a lot of the same sentiments here, right? In terms of them complaining about feeling like they have to parent their Gen Z workers, and you know how they don't follow directions and all that kind of stuff. And I'm gonna be honest, right? One, obviously, 1,000 people is not a huge sample size, especially if you're looking to represent all of America. So I would have to take this with a grain of salt, just based off of that alone, right? And then you also have to wonder, like, what type of industries do they actually survey in? And on top of that, I feel like one of these things that kind of gets lost in translation is, people complaining about the younger generation is something that's been happening as old as time. You can literally find um, a quote from like freaking Aristotle where he was talking about how young people were annoying and didn't listen or something like that. So, you know, I'm wondering how much of that is also just the typical things that you expect from generation to generation. Yeah, you could literally see this here. This is it wasn't Aristotle, sorry, it was Socrates. He literally, like, if you were to take out who said this, I would not be surprised, or people would not be surprised if they were talking about something in the current day. So, like, the act of, the young generation being disappointing or being coddled or whatever, like, that has been as old as time itself. So I would also be curious to see what surveys about younger people from, like, the 80s or the 90s or the 70s, how what is said about them back then as well. I don't feel like looking to find that right now, but I would be curious as to see what the narrative was back then as well. I think that's just something to consider.
What is it about Gen Z that is making employers incredibly frustrated with them as a whole? Well, it's a few reasons. Well, the first is that this always happens. I mean, every generation faces the same lazy and entitled label until they become an elder generation. There's no doubt in my mind there's a massive component of that in this. Baby boomers were dubbed the me generation in the 1970s, and critics said that they were self-absorbed, they were pleasure-seeking, and unwilling to conform to traditional work norms. Despite being raised by the so-called self-sacrificing greatest generation, boomers were seen as rejecting discipline in favor of personal fulfillment. Gen X were the original slackers, branded cynical, aimless, and disloyal. They came of age during economic uncertainty and rising divorce rates. Media in the 90s labeled them as apathetic, unmotivated, too skeptical to care, too jaded to try. Millennials, I mean, same thing. I mean, Time Magazine, for example, did an iconic 2013 cover calling them narcissistic and entitled. They were accused of craving praise, avoiding hard work, and killing traditional industries with their demand for flexibility and purpose. And is that too dissimilar from Gen Z? Because this is where we're at now, and they seem to be the most difficult generation to manage. Surveys show that hiring managers consider them entitled, soft, unprepared, quick to ask for more, slow to adapt to workplace norms. Terms like quiet quitting and lazy girl jobs have fueled the backlash. And that is why I'm making this video today. The pattern repeats. The reality is that what each generation calls entitlement was often just the next generation adapting to a new economy, new technologies, and different values. But the script stays the same. They're lazy and we don't like them. And this will honestly never stop. I mean, every generation has different tech, different stimulus.
Yeah, hopefully we can be the generation to buck that trend of just hating on the young people when we get older. But I mean, I already see the way people talk about Gen Alpha and like I guess the generation now that it, and I'm not gonna hold my breath on that, to be honest.
Stimulus, different ways of adapting to the world around it because we're growing up in different worlds. And so as long as there's technological progress, there's social progress, and the advancement of humans, each and every new generation will just seem completely foreign to the generations that came before it, even though they're not really that dissimilar. A big reason why work ethic seems to be at the core of this generational divide that keeps showing itself is that in earlier generations, there wasn't a follow your passion narrative that there kind of is now. It was about showing up, doing what you were told, no matter how terrible that might be, and earning your place over time, often without feedback or mentorship or flexibility. It's just like, this is the way it's.
And I think part of that is also just because like nowadays there's a lot more focus on the like individualism is on the rise, right? Like back then, there was a lot more of a collectivist mindset, right? About doing what's best for your group, doing what's best for the country, doing what's best for your neighbors. Whereas nowadays it's about the ethos of 2025 is no one owes, I don't owe anyone anything. And so I'm going to do whatever I want. And I think that like, when you look at how it would permeate in terms of work, right? Like if the job doesn't get done, I'm not going to be taken advantage of. If I'm not getting paid what I'm worth, I'm not really going to try, right? Like you see a lot of that. So I don't know if that makes the older gens complaints more legitimate, or if it's just a matter of them wanting Gen Z to go through the same workplace pitfalls that they went through, and Gen Z kind of just sees the writing on the wall for what it is. So it's really up to you if you want to go with either narrative on that.
It's done, do it. From their lens, watching a 24-year-old come straight out of school and demand remote work, mental health stipends, and purpose-driven projects, like to them, it just sounds ridiculous. And if you understand that, well, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. So if every generation gets this kind of heat, why does it feel extra hot on Gen Z? The second reason is amplification. In previous decades, criticism of the youngest up-and-coming generation was always reserved for, some media spots, water cooler conversation, your uncle, your neighbor, whatever. They were sort of isolated, one-off events. It was sort of like an understanding that, the young people are so lazy or whatever. But it wasn't like in your face as much. Now you have countless videos.
This is true. Social media is going to take any narrative and just amplify to like the extremes. And like you said, back then, like the narratives were way more self-contained. Although I don't think it's just that though, because I feel like though I remember when I was a kid, I remember like the young adult at the time. So what the millennials would be now. I remember that narrative being pretty commonplace for them as well. Even before social media kind of like took off and pretty much became the end all be all of where people got their information from.
Videos and memes and social media content online that amplify the difference between generations. And honestly, those kinds of videos and pieces of content do really well because people relate to one thing or another. You either think the next gen is lazy and silly, or you think the older gen is way out of touch, crusty, whatever, right? You align yourself with one and you poke fun at the other. And another facet to that is people want to know why previous generations or newer generations see them so differently than they see themselves. A great example of that right now is the Gen Z stare trend. And this is something that's getting so much traction online. And essentially what it is, it's a neutral, expressionless look in social or work settings. Experts link it to the events of 2020, perhaps, maybe screen-based communication and shifting norms. But in my opinion, it seems like Gen Z is just having a really tough time hiding how dumb they think someone sounds, or how annoyed they think someone sounds, or confused they are, or whatever it is, right? And why is that? Why are they just so out in the open with what they're thinking visually? From an older perspective, it just reads as disrespect when you just blankly stare at somebody. It's like, don't do that, right? Many grew up in workplaces where eye contact, facial expressions, and verbal confirmation were expected and honestly sometimes demanded. And if a younger employee doesn't mirror that, or worse, they just stare at them blankly like they're insane, it's taken as a challenge or a lack of effort. Whether that's fair or not, it certainly makes the relationship a lot different. The third reason, and honestly, this might be one thing that boomers have right, is that Gen Z is just not that great at communication. Or is that total nonsense? Gen Z's communication style is one of the most misunderstood aspects in today's workplace.
I would probably say, due to my opinion on this would be, before he speaks, is I feel like this would probably be down more to the way social media has kind of permeated every facet of our lives. There's um, a lot more context heavy, like phrases or slang terms. It has just become much more embedded into everyday language. So you kind of have to keep up with the trends of what words are in right now, to kind of really be able to communicate properly with specifically like the younger generation. So I could definitely understand from the older perspective when it's like, you're expecting more formal language, more direct communication, and you kind of get something that resembles like basically a different language, and you're just kind of like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. So I can definitely understand why that would be frustrating. And I also just think too, like the guy alludes to when it comes to technology, is that Gen Z has just kind of grown up with different ways of expression, um, that doesn't lend itself as much to um, verbal communication in the way that older people experienced it. So I think that coupled with what I just said is kind of led to this schism in terms of why communication between generations is so lacking and weird.
And the truth is, honestly, it's a lot more nuanced than they're just bad at talking or they can't hold a conversation. This will surprise literally nobody, but Gen Z, believe it or not, really excels in digital communication and is by far the most adept generation at communicating online. It's not even close. A Canadian survey found that 57% say remote work actually improved their writing skills, far, far, far outpacing boomers, and they're fluent in visual platforms and short form messaging, multi-channel conversations. I mean, they are whizzes with communication on the digital front. They also place a high value on empathy and emotional intelligence, with many actively seeking to build soft skills, according to Deloitte. But face-to-face communication is where the gap becomes factually visible, and that's where employers are honestly having the toughest time with Gen Z. A Forbes survey found that 24% of Gen Z respondents said their verbal skills have worsened due to remote learning and working, compared to just 5% of boomers. In the office, this shows up in subtle but jarring ways. One example, again, is the Gen Z stare. I mean, it is a real thing. It's been interpreted by older coworkers as maybe rude, disengaged, passive aggressive. It's less about attitude, more about the unfamiliarity.
Yeah, I think maybe it's more so that they're just trying to process uh, the information that people are saying at them. Because, right, like when you're learning online and when you do a lot of stuff in isolation, you get to, one of the things that kind of happens is you get to engage with information at your own pace because you're not really reacting to things, right? Like if you're watching an online lecture and you miss something that your teacher is saying, right, you can rewind, you can slow down the pace of the video. If you think your teacher is going too slow and you're just trying to get through a lecture, you can, increase it by like, you can increase the pace of the video. So you get to engage with information at your own speed that you would like, as opposed to when you are in person with someone, right? Like you can't fast forward how someone speaks or slow down how someone speaks, right? So you have to engage with it in real time. So I think it could just be one of those things where the quote unquote Gen Z stare, if it's not because someone says something stupid, is because they're just actively trying to process what they're being told in real time. I think that you could probably make an argument for that.
with nonverbal workplace norms that weren't maybe learned in Zoom classrooms or something like that. I mean, it really is sort of a weirdness that boomers and older generations seem to feel. And, I don't think they're totally off base. And it's not a stretch to say that some Gen Zs are certainly not as great communicators in person as generations of the past. The thing is, the corporate of old was expected to speak up in meetings, to make phone calls, to project, to be great presenters. That is how a lot of business is done, is being front facing, confident, all those kinds of things. They had no choice but to develop these muscles if they wanted to move up the corporate ladder. So,
but I also think that also makes sense from when you look at the time spine, when you look at the time that they lived in, right? Like information wasn't as readily available. So, right, like if you are presenting information that your boss doesn't have or their boss's boss doesn't have, you are the arbiter of that information, right? So if you don't present it properly, if you don't communicate it well, they are just not going to have it. They're just not going to know, right? As opposed to these days, right? Like someone can literally be speaking and you can like literally fact check them on command, whether you're using AI or you're using Google or whatever. So I think people are just used to not like the whole concept of presenting information has been kind of, I don't want to say lost, like in terms of its importance, but it's definitely not as high as it used to be because it's just easier to find information now, generally, just because due to obviously like the internet and smartphones and stuff like that.
perhaps when they see a younger coworker send a Slack message to somebody that's a 10-second walk away or on the other side of the building where they could just go have a quick conversation and they'd rather avoid that confrontation or that chat, it does seem a little foreign to them. The less you use something, the less it gets developed. And honestly, the foundational years of 2020, 21, and 22 are showing that some of Gen Z skills have atrophied when they should have been developing the most. The fourth reason why employers are struggling is honestly, Gen Z just doesn't really put up with a lot of stuff. They have a much higher standard for their employers, and they are significantly less tolerant of perceived injustices against them or to those around them. In some, they don't put up with the same BS that previous generations had to stomach, and they're not afraid to walk away from something if the expectations are not met. In fact, another Deloitte study found that the vast majority of Gen Z respondents said they would reject a job if the employer's values did not align with their own. And honestly, this is not just talk. I mean, this generation has led unionization efforts at companies like Amazon and Starbucks and Google, pushing them for better pay, safety, and flexibility. Have they been very successful at that? Maybe not, but they're not afraid to challenge the system, even if it costs them job security. They're driving changes in what workers expect from their employers and what they'll no longer tolerate. This is also a generation that's hyper aware of injustice.
Yeah, he was just about to say it to him. I think just with the way information flows, it's very easy for especially our generation to get a better sense of the context of the world around them. So I think when you live in the information age, you kind of have to, and you're really aware of just what it is that you're doing, or more so the opportunities that are really truly available to you. It will definitely inform your decision making a lot more, right? Like we obviously know about the housing crisis going on. We know about houses being bought up, about how the expectations for what a salary can get you is a lot lower, about how entry jobs are harder to get, about how AI has been, replacing a lot of white collar work, about how companies have been downsizing their workforce to save money and improve profits for their shareholders. So when all this information is out there and easily accessible, it's kind of hard not to be jaded, right? It's kind of hard not to feel like the job that you have isn't going to be, especially if you don't feel like you're going to be your ticket to a good life, then why would you, and naturally, why would you put up with X, Y, and Z if this job is a job that you don't even perceive to be quote unquote that worth it in the first place? So I think that's just something to consider. That's definitely something that the older generation would not have had to reconcile with at large, right? Like obviously, I'm sure people individually were kind of aware of these things, but there's definitely not information that was available to a whole generation of people. So
justice and being raised on social media, they've seen a lot of nasty stuff. They're more likely to call out discrimination, inequality, mental health stigma loudly and publicly. That's going to make some employers uncomfortable. very uncomfortable. Older generations were often taught that you earn your voice over time. They see it as disrespect when a 22-year-old pushes back on day 3. Not every job is toxic. Not every boss is abusive. Sometimes Gen Z might mistake hard work for unfair treatment, and that can make it harder for older managers to coach and invest in them. The last big divide is remote work. Based on literally everything we've talked about in this video, and for obvious convenience reasons, Gen Z would strongly prefer to work remotely because they are much more well-suited and skilled to do so on average. But there's a caveat. While older generations had to adapt to digital tools, Gen Z came of age on them. So it makes sense that they're the ones pushing hardest for flexibility. Many say that they'd walk away from a job if it didn't offer at least some remote option. And it's hard not to see why. But here's where it gets misunderstood. A lot of them don't want to work fully remote. In fact, the majority prefer a hybrid setup that combines the focus of work from home with the connection and mentorship that happens in person. They're not trying to avoid the office entirely. They just want to use it more intentionally and for a purpose. It is very difficult for some employers to wrap their heads around this. But yes, a lot of Gen Z folks actually do enjoy coming into the office every now and again to get out of the house and switch up their routine. It's when they have to commute 2 to 3 hours a day, every single day, where it becomes a lot more annoying. And from the older Gen angle, like, I get it. We did it for 40 years. What makes you so special? To them, remote work still feels like a perk, something that is given, not granted. And when they hear younger workers complain about going into the office every day during the week, it genuinely feels like entitlement. In my opinion, honestly, this whole thing can be boiled down to collaboration, right? There's brilliant, wonderful people in every generation. I mean, that's an obvious thing. But I think so many of these people that complain on both sides, like people complaining about boomers, people complaining about Gen Z, just are non-empathetic to how things were for the older gens or the younger gens, right? Like, it's just two completely different worlds. And so if you can understand that Gen Z has developed a much different skill set, but a really, really advanced and modern skill set that can leverage and help you grow your company to God knows how big, well, then leverage that. And if you're a younger folk trying to find your way in the corporate ladder and trying to advance your career, understand that some of those more traditional, maybe more archaic things, maybe things that you think are silly, matter to them, and trade off on that. And if you can make those trade-offs and work collaboratively, all generations involved in the company are going to benefit.
Okay, so that seems like the end of the video. No, I really liked where you ended off that too. Yeah, it's really important to understand the thought process of, what the older generations are saying and why they're saying it. Because it's very easy to just look at the words in isolation and just think, oh, like they're just being dumb, they're just being old, they're just being archaic. But you have to understand the context of what they are surrounded with to understand why they say what they say. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with everything that they say, but knowing that context is definitely going to inform your decision making a lot more and enable you to better relate with them, as well as to better integrate kind of what they're saying into your ethos. But overall, though, I thought this was a good video, and it's definitely a ongoing challenge. So I would definitely be excited to see kind of where we are in like 10, 15 years, kind of see the progress of that when the Gen Z kind of integrates significantly more into the workforce. But yeah, that's going to be it for today, or at least for this video anyway. So if you liked it, please subscribe to my channel, but I'm going to leave a link to the original video as well. And most importantly of all, remember to have a good day.